Hello and welcome to our virtual professional development session. Today's focus is going to be on Ohio's five-step process, which is a cycle of inquiry. Let's go ahead and get started. Right, so our objectives today is to introduce to you the Ohio improvement process, specifically step three, which involves Ohio's five-step process. We're going to be providing to you some practical examples for how to use Ohio's five-step process, as well as trying to sort of communicate the benefits that this process has to offer you as a teacher, to our buildings, and ultimately to our students. So this is part of the Ohio improvement process. What is that? The Ohio improvement process is a mechanism for enacting Ohio's leadership development framework. What does that mean? The framework is the use of collaborative leadership structures, which we have at our district, such as our district leadership team, our DLT, our building leadership teams, and our teacher-based teams. So our DLTs, our BLTs, and our TBTs, these are collaborative leadership structures, which we use to share responsibility for improving school achievement. That is the Ohio Leadership Development Framework. The OIP is there to enact that. In this presentation, our focus is on the third stage of the Ohio improvement process, in which we find embedded the cycle that you see here. This is Ohio's five-step process, a cycle of inquiry. Ohio's five-step process is an Ohio Improvement Plan protocol that can be used by all levels of our shared leadership team. So it can be used by the DLT, the BLT, and our TBTs. And this involves improving and in monitoring adult practices, so what we do in our buildings, based on effective and ongoing data analysis. So we're collecting data, analyzing, and implementing best practices as a result of that data. At the TBT level, which is where most of we are as teachers, this five-step process can be used to generate common formative assessments. We can analyze student data, and most importantly, though, determine and implement effective instructional strategies based on your students' learning needs as revealed by the data that you collect. So right now, we're going to take a look at each step in detail. But before I begin, the first step is data collection. And this process is pretty involved. It's pretty data intensive. And before we get too much into what data you're collecting, I want to have you give some thoughts to how you will collect it. I encourage you to take advantage of some of the common reporting forms that I have provided samples for you. For example, here we see TBT, five-step process, meeting agenda. And we have areas to note what department and grade level, who's timekeeping, what the date was, the members present. And then we have each of the five steps of the five-step process delineated here with areas to fill in what data we're collecting, noting what data points we're looking at specifically and what actions we're going to be taking. Why are we doing this? Why do we need to fill out such rigid forms? Essentially, it helps keep us focused on our mission, establishing agreed upon order for our meetings, identifying guidelines, setting timetables, and just establishing solid group procedures, just like we established solid classroom procedures, will help save time, keep our groups focused on the energy at the task at hand, and also helping us to ultimately build consensus to determine what job needs done and how we're going to do that. So as I said, the first step of this process is data collection. What data are we collecting here? Here are some data points that might be gathered by you guys as teachers in your TBT. And I want you to note that these data points come from multiple areas. So they are coming from the students, they're coming from teachers, they're coming from parents or other stakeholders. And there are multiple data types as well. Some of these are going to be hard numbers, as in, grades on an assessment. And other data points might be more narratives or reflections. So, for example, data points, multiple sources of data might include results of teacher-created assessments, end-of-unit assessments, standardized testing results, Common formative assessments, disciplinary referrals, teacher generated reflections or narratives, stakeholder surveys, parent communication logs, data on adult implementation of professional development or best practices that we're monitoring. Um, all of these are multiple sources of data. So after the data is collected, the data is then analyzed. Data analysis in this context might be simple, guys, as describing or illustrating or just recapping the data that you found. All of this right now, it seems kind of overwhelming. So we're going to choose a specific example and one data point, and we're going to see what we might be able to do with that. So for example, of all of these issues, all of these data sources, let's focus right here, disciplinary referrals. Let's say that you, as a TBT, collected this data point and you found that there were 30 disciplinary referrals over the past academic year. The next step, what do you do with that number, with 30? The next step is data disaggregation, which is essentially breaking down the data to include subpopulations. Here, that data has been broken down into grade level. So, of all the school students that had in-school suspension referrals, we see it broken down by grade level. The majority of them were in grade 10. And of course, if we stopped there, we might be tempted to conclude, oh, well, we all knew the sophomores weren't very good this year. Nah. We'll further disaggregate the data into more subpopulations. For example, students with in school suspension referrals, most of them were males, not entirely shocking. But let's disaggregate a little further and see what else we can discover. Of students with in school suspension referrals, um, the vast majority of them, 87%, were not involved in any form of extracurricular. Of all students with in school suspension referrals over the last year, the vast majority, 87%, were socioeconomically disadvantaged. And now we've revealed a couple data points through this process of disaggregation that might be useful to us. For example, those of you who are involved in your own studies in curriculum or development, or through professional development, best practices or research might be coming forward to you. For example, a researcher named Manlove, as well as the US Department of Justice, which is referenced at the end of this presentation, has linked extracurricular participation to lower instances of in school suspensions or disciplinary referrals. Likewise, the US Department of Justice has linked low socioeconomic status to higher instances of disciplinary referrals in school. And so you can see by this process of taking a large data point here and disaggregating it into subpopulations, we might be able to find ways that might serve to improve this number. For example, we might encourage students to involve themselves in extracurriculars, or we may take steps to mitigate these students with socioeconomic disadvantage in an attempt to improve this number overall. But that's running ahead of ourselves a little bit. The first step is just collecting the data and observing where they are, where they fall into these subpopulations. Where can you find all of this information? In the students' folders in the main office, but it's also mostly available on Progress Book. Students who are available are obviously grade levels are on Progress Book. Males and females are there, as well as involvement and low socioeconomic status is noted in all of our SLOs at the start of the year. And so this data is available to us. Very good. The next step of the process, now that the data has been collected and disaggregated, the data is now analyzed. What does that mean? Well, we evaluate the data with special attention paid to the strengths and weaknesses that data might reveal. A crucial element here, guys, is teacher collaboration. You guys all know that as teachers, you spend your time mostly in your classroom, right? You're putting in the hard work with your students and focusing in on your content. But working in that kind of isolation, we may miss critical issues that could help us change practices or reveal that we need to change some practices in a way that would benefit student achievement. And looking at just an example of this, say we've got our freshman algebra teacher notices students are having a hard time with word problems, or our history teacher is also noticing students are performing poorly on assessments that require them to pull details from a text. We have another teacher, an English teacher, in their classroom, noticing students are unable to write effective analytical essays. With these students, or rather these teachers, working in isolation, that data is noticed, but it's not effectively analyzed. It's not recognized for what it is, a systemic deficiency in this particular group of students. So let's try again. Let's back up and we'll say that our TBT at the start of the year met at a grade level TBT meeting. And you were using research, collaborating to categorize questions in all of your end of year assessments. And you categorized your assessment questions under Bloom's taxonomy. So you're labeling each question and your various assessments across your content areas, questions as pertaining to knowledge, questions pertaining to comprehension, application, analysis, and synthesis and evaluation. You meet again mid-year as a grade level TBT. And again, we're analyzing this data now, but our first step is to collect and disaggregate. You have disaggregated your assessment data by question type, knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, and this synthesis. So this has been pulled across your grade level and across your content areas, questions as pertaining to each of these. And what we can see from this is a slight strength in the application questioning type, but also a clear weakness in analysis. So this reveals to us that our students are having trouble with analytical thinking. This is a conclusion that might not have been arrived at if those teachers had stayed in their math, history, and English classes, sort of pondering to themselves why their students are having trouble with this particular type of question. The data generated, pulled out, and disaggregated by the TBT and analyzed, we see that our students are having trouble with a particular area. So we've collected our data. We've disaggregated the data. We have analyzed that data and we've revealed a weakness. The next step is to identify best practices from research that lead to specific changes in our instructional program, how we are addressing our students, how we're teaching them, in order to increase student achievement. In order to achieve this goal, you guys as a TBT will need to establish a shared set of expectations. What are you guys going to do to address the issues revealed by the data? You might use a set of guiding questions like these to help you establish your shared expectations. For example, you might ask yourselves, after you have the data all laid out, what specific changes are we going to make to address the revealed areas of strength or weakness? What are our shared expectations for implementing those changes? How are we going to monitor and measure implementation? These are questions that you, as a grade level of TBT, will be answering. If we think back to our example of a grade level TBT that noticed a deficit in students' analytical thinking ability, as defined in Bloom's taxonomy of learning, and revealed by the data that they collected via those collaborative assessments, let's take a look at what this TBT might do to address those guiding questions. So these are the shared expectations that that TBT might implement. So what specific changes? They do the reading, they look at the research, and they implement these best practices from research. They decide that in order to increase analytical thinking ability, they're going to implement in their classroom Bloom's spiraling and also project-based learning. What are their shared expectations for implementing? How are they going to get this done? Agreeing as a group that each content area will use at least one of these two instructional methods during the week for the remainder of the school year. So once a week in each content area, they've decided that they will use either Bloom spiraling or a project-based learning approach. They decide together how they will monitor and then measure their implementation. They decide that lesson plans that utilize either of these techniques will be uploaded to a shared drive, and that informal classroom observations between their own TBT members, so leadership not involved here, are observing and refining and critiquing these instructional methods. Very good. So within that, establishing shared expectations. Of course, differentiation for instruction is always going to be necessary. Um, Content level TBTs, and this example, will further establish how the grade level TBT expectations can be adapted to their content area. So this, right, Bloom spiraling and project-based learning, it is going to look different in a world language class than it would from a math class. And so our content area TBT is going to work together in order to implement these goals. And so, working under what the TBT goals are, the content areas may adapt or differentiate their instruction according to the needs of their particular content. Very good. So, step 4, we now have collected and disaggregated our data. We have analyzed our strengths and weaknesses, and we have established shared expectations for what changes we're going to implement. And now it comes down to actually implementing and monitoring those changes. We did a little bit of this work already. Implementing the changes, we decided what we were going to do. In our example, our content area, or excuse me, our grade level, actually, TBT, will use at least one of the two instructional methods, Bloom spiraling or project based learning, each week for the remainder of the school year. So in step 4, that is actually implemented. So, interventions for struggling students. We, of course, know that just because we are implementing a new tier 1 intervention, right, something that we're doing for all students in order to improve a specific area of need, that does not mean that every student is going to respond in the same way. And so, assessment data is still collected at regular intervals and discussed at TBT meetings as necessary. If that disaggregated data reveals that some students are not responding to our tier 1 interventions, which again in our example, Bloom spiraling and project-based learning, tier 2 interventions are established based upon research in alignment with our wider tier 2 strategies as a school. Tier 2 and tier 3 strategies are obviously gone over together as a school at the beginning of the school year, largely in conjunction with our school's intervention specialists. Just one second if I figure out where I am. Slide 21. Very good. So at the end of this process, we collect our data again. And of course, we're paying special attention to the analysis of the disaggregated data points that we first revealed. We pull all of this together and we're monitoring how the adults in the building implemented this. Our shared expectations were that lesson plans that utilize these strategies are uploaded and that informal observations are happening. During your regular TBT meetings in this examples, these teachers should be reviewing successes, areas for growth that they gleaned from their classroom observations, which, in my opinion, there's really no better way to become a better teacher than by watching good teachers. They're sharing lesson plans that the teachers believe specifically aided student understanding and that revealed area of deficit skill. The final step, so we have collected and disaggregated the data. We have analyzed the data to reveal student weaknesses and strengths. We have established a set of shared expectations for how we're going to implement and monitor. We have done the actual work, implemented and monitored the changes, as well as monitored adult implementation. This is what we said we were going to do. Did the adults actually do it? Our last step here is to collect, chart, and analyze that post data and determine how effective was our plan. How effective were our new practices in doing what we wanted them to do? So some course correction. If you get the data and it hasn't done what you wanted it to do, or if it has, we're going to require some reviewing our implementation openly and honestly. Were the changes made with fidelity? Did did these changes result in any measurable gains? If so, or if not, those results can inform the next cycle. Were there recurrent challenges to implementing the experience by several TBT members? If so, that's something to analyze in the future. And additionally, what professional development or tangible needs do we need to improve our implementation? For example, in our example of this grade level TBTs that required or that were seeing a deficit in analytical thinking skills, perhaps teacher needs some professional development in bloom spiraling or in project-based learning. Under our example, so teachers about December 2020, they had their disaggregated data, which revealed a weakness in the analysis questioning type. They do that same routine in May or at the end of the year. And they either notice an improvement, as I have here in my example, or they do not notice an improvement. And of course, negative results are still results. Our last action here, analyzing post data, collecting, charting, and analyzing post data. We identify the best practices that have been gained as a result of this five-step process. We find what worked, what measurably worked, and we share that with our colleagues via our BLT. From the grade level BLT, TBT, those results and recommendations go to the BLT with feedback. BLT, if they find that this is useful, may pass that along to the DLT. We report our results and our recommendations for future professional development, which then can be considered at a building or a district level. Very good. That is all for me. Just a reflection on this process. As I reflected on this presentation, this sort of imagined professional development scenario, or really just on Ohio's five-step process in general, it was clear to me from our readings that several of the mechanisms present in the Ohio five-step process really aligned well with the leadership theories that were addressed in our green text. This process itself is a series of prescribed actions, right? It's a set of sequential steps. And that really does fall under the umbrella of normative theory, which was discussed in our green text, which was chapter 6, page 180. And of course, in that same chapter, we're presented with a range of leadership styles, which range from the purely autocratic all the way to joint decision-making and delegation. One specific leadership theory there, the Vroom-Yetton, not pronouncing that correctly, model, as discussed in the green text, chapter 6, page 185 and 186, would probably describe the Ohio five-step process as a group decision-making, as a group decision. Here, leaders and followers are working together to gather data, to share information, and to come to a collaborative conclusion, to collaboratively design improvement methods, best practices for improvement. As Green notes, it's a basic assumption from the Vroom-Yetton model that the more influence that the followers have in the decision-making process, the more motivated that they will be to implement those changes. And of course, Ohio's five-step process provides an opportunity. That's the staff are doing the change. The staff are gathering the data. They are largely coming up with these solutions. And so as they themselves are going through this cycle of reflection and inquiry, if it's implemented correctly, this should result in measurable improvements, or at least in finding out what doesn't work to solve a specific problem. By working within the collaborative leadership structures, our TBTs, BLTs, and DLT, whose members have already been brought together because of their relevant zone of concern and level of expertise, we can feel reasonably confident that these decisions that we come to as a result of Ohio's five-step process will be decisions of quality. Okay, thank you so much for watching my presentation. Have a good day.